The house on the lake had always been a place of mystery. It stood alone on the water's edge, surrounded by dense, towering pines, its reflection rippling on the dark surface of the lake. The locals in the nearby town of Ravenwood spoke of it in hushed tones, recounting tales of strange occurrences and ominous sightings. But for me, it was the perfect escape. I had recently gone through a rough patch. Work was stressful, my relationships were strained, and I desperately needed a break. When I found the listing for the house on the lake, it seemed like fate. The photos showed a beautiful, old Victorian house with a wraparound porch, large windows that offered stunning views of the water, and a dock that extended out into the lake. The price was surprisingly low, but I didn't question it. I booked it immediately, eager for a week of solitude. When I arrived, the house was even more impressive in person. The late afternoon sun bathed the lake in a golden light, and the house seemed to glow in the warm rays. But as I approached, a chill ran down my spine. The air around the house felt heavy, almost oppressive, as if the place itself was watching me. I shook off the feeling and stepped inside. The interior was beautifully preserved, with antique furniture, ornate woodwork, and high ceilings. The house had a certain charm, but there was also something unsettling about it, an air of neglect, as if it had been waiting too long for someone to return. The first night was peaceful. I sat on the porch, watching the moon rise over the lake, the water reflecting the silver light. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in months. But that calm was short-lived. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness fell over the lake, I began to hear things, faint, almost imperceptible sounds coming from the water. At first, I thought it was just the normal creaking of the dock or the gentle lap of waves against the shore. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew louder, more distinct. It was a rhythmic tapping, like something hard knocking against wood. It echoed across the lake, coming from the direction of the dock. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just an old boat or debris caught in the current. But the tapping continued, steady and relentless, until it was impossible to ignore. Reluctantly, I grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the dock. The air was cold, and a thick mist had begun to rise from the lake, swirling around my feet as I walked. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but it did little to ease my growing sense of dread. When I reached the dock, the tapping stopped. I stood there, shining the light over the water, searching for the source of the noise. But there was nothing, just the inky blackness of the lake stretching out into the night. I turned to head back to the house, but as I did, something caught my eye. A small, dark shape floating just beneath the surface, near the end of the dock. It was barely visible in the dim light, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. I knelt down, leaning closer to the water, trying to get a better look. As I did, the shape began to rise, slowly emerging from the depths. It was a wooden rowboat, old and weathered, its sides covered in algae and rot. But what unnerved me the most was that it was empty. No oars, no ropes, nothing to explain how it had drifted there. As I stared at the boat, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. The air grew colder, the mist thickening around me, and I felt a presence, a cold, malevolent force watching me from the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as the boat began to move, gliding silently across the water, heading directly toward the dock. Panic seized me, and I scrambled to my feet, nearly dropping the flashlight in my haste. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran back to the house, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of the tapping echoing in my ears. Back inside, I locked the door and bolted the windows, trying to shake off the terror that had gripped me. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong with the house on the lake. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the silence, waiting for the tapping to start again. But instead of the tapping, I heard something else. A soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps moving across the floorboards downstairs. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving through the house, growing closer with each passing second. My mind raced. There was no one else in the house, no reason for those footsteps to be there. But they continued, climbing the stairs, pausing outside my door. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The door creaked open, and for a moment, I could see nothing but darkness. Then a shadowy figure appeared, standing in the doorway, its form indistinct, almost as if it were made of smoke. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around me, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee. But I couldn't. I was trapped, held in place by an invisible force, as the figure slowly began to approach. Just as it reached the foot of the bed, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out, but when I awoke, the room was empty. The door was closed and the house was silent once more. I didn't wait to find out what had happened. I grabbed my things and left the house as quickly as I could, fleeing into the early morning light. As I drove away, I didn't look back, not even once. The house on the lake is still there, waiting for its next guest. But I won't be going back, and I won't speak of what I saw. Some places are better left alone, their secrets buried in the dark waters, hidden from the light of day. It was supposed to be the perfect summer holiday. My friends and I had planned it for months, a week at a secluded beach house, far from the bustle of the city. We imagined days spent lounging in the sun, swimming in the crystal clear ocean, and nights filled with laughter, bonfires, and starry skies. The house we found was ideal, a charming old cottage on the edge of a small coastal town, surrounded by dunes and seagrasses, with a private stretch of beach just steps away. When we arrived, the weather was perfect. The sun was high in the sky, and a gentle breeze carried the salty scent of the ocean. The house was everything we had hoped for, with whitewashed walls, weathered wooden floors, and large windows that offered stunning views of the sea. The town was quaint, with a few shops and cafes, but otherwise it was just us and the endless horizon. The first few days were exactly as we had imagined. We swam in the ocean, explored the nearby cliffs, and spent long afternoons basking in the sun. At night, we gathered around a bonfire on the beach, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The isolation of the place was a welcome escape from our busy lives, a chance to reconnect with each other in the natural world. But as the week went on, something changed. It started with small things, misplaced items, strange noises in the night, a feeling of being watched. At first, we laughed it off, blaming the wind or our own forgetfulness. But the incidents became more frequent, more unsettling. The wind seemed to howl a little louder at night, and the house, which had once felt cozy, now seemed to creak and groan as if it were alive. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the beach in a golden glow, I decided to take a walk alone. The others were still inside, preparing dinner, so I slipped out the back door and headed toward the water. The beach was deserted. The only sounds, the gentle crash of the waves and the distant cry of seagulls. I walked along the shoreline, letting the cool water lap at my feet, enjoying the solitude. But as I reached the end of the beach, near a cluster of jagged rocks, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There, in the sand, were footprints, fresh and deep, leading from the water's edge toward the dunes. They weren't mine, and they certainly weren't from any of my friends. The prints were large, and the way they pressed into the sand suggested that whoever or whatever had made them was heavy, with a long stride. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight, just the empty beach and the darkening sky. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the footprints. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, starting at the water's edge, as if the person, or creature, had walked straight out of the ocean. I followed them with my eyes as they disappeared into the dunes, swallowed by the shadows of the tall grasses. I turned back toward the house, suddenly eager to be back with my friends. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt thicker, the wind colder, and the once welcoming beach now seemed menacing, as if it were hiding something just out of sight. When I returned to the house, I didn't mention the footprints to the others. I wasn't sure what to say, and I didn't want to ruin the mood. But that night, as we sat around the table, a sense of unease settled over us. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the lights flickered, as if the house itself was reacting to something unseen. As the night wore on, the strange occurrences became impossible to ignore. The power went out suddenly, plunging the house into darkness. We scrambled to find flashlights and candles, our laughter now tinged with nervousness. The wind outside grew stronger, whipping the sand against the windows, creating a sound like nails on a chalkboard. Then we heard it, a loud scraping noise coming from the roof, as if something heavy was dragging itself across the shingles. We froze, exchanging terrified glances, the light from our flashlights casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. "Did you hear that?" one of my friends whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. We all nodded, too scared to speak. The scraping sound continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the house to the other. It was followed by a thud, as if something had jumped or fallen from the roof, landing heavily on the ground outside. In the silence that followed, we heard the front door creak open. My heart pounded in my chest as we huddled together, too afraid to move. The door creaked again, slowly, as if someone or something was pushing it open. The air in the room grew colder, and the wind outside seemed to die down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, shaking the entire house. We jumped, our flashlights flickering as if in response to the sudden shock. The scraping noise returned, but this time, it was inside the house, moving across the floorboards above us. Panic set in. We scrambled to find a way out, but the windows were stuck, and the back door wouldn't budge. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, heavy and slow, as if whatever was inside was taking its time, savoring our fear. Finally, one of my friends managed to pry open a window and we climbed out, desperate to escape the house. We ran down to the beach, not stopping until we reached the water's edge, where the waves crashed against the shore with a force that matched our racing hearts. We spent the rest of the night on the beach, huddled together under the cold night sky, too afraid to go back to the house. As dawn broke, we gathered our things and left, abandoning the holiday that had turned into a nightmare. We never spoke of what happened that night, and we never returned to that beach. But sometimes, when the wind howls outside my window, I remember the scraping sound on the roof, the heavy footsteps, and the unexplained footprints in the sand. And I wonder what might have happened if we hadn't left when we did. The Airbnb listing had promised an escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. A beautifully restored Victorian house, tucked away in a quiet town, perfect for a weekend of solitude and reflection. The photos showed elegant rooms, antique furniture, and most captivating of all, a large ornate mirror in the master bedroom. The reviews were positive, though one mentioned the house having an unusual energy. Intrigued, I booked it for 2 nights, eager to experience something different. I arrived on a Saturday afternoon, greeted by a house that was even grander in person. The Victorian architecture stood tall against the backdrop of dense woods, with intricate woodwork and large bay windows. The host had left a key in a lockbox, and as I stepped inside, I was immediately struck by the sense of stepping back in time. The house was filled with period details, velvet drapes, oil paintings, and the rich scent of polished wood. The master bedroom was just as impressive, dominated by the large mirror that had caught my eye in the photos. It was nearly 7 feet tall, framed in dark, intricately carved wood that seemed to absorb the light. The glass was slightly tarnished, adding an air of mystery. I stood before it, feeling a strange pull, as if the mirror was more than just a reflection. As night fell, I settled into the house, enjoying the quiet and the sense of being completely alone. The hours slipped by, and soon it was time for bed. The wind picked up outside, rustling the leaves and making the house creak. Despite the cozy bed, sleep didn't come easily. There was an unsettling stillness in the room, a sense that something was just out of sight. Sometime after midnight, I awoke with a start. The room was dark, but I could see the outline of the mirror from the faint moonlight seeping through the curtains. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed something strange. A figure in the mirror. At first, I thought it was my own reflection, distorted by sleep and shadows. But as I stared, the figure remained unmoving, while I lay still in bed. The figure was that of a woman, dressed in a flowing gown, her features indistinct but her presence undeniable. She stood on the other side of the glass, as if the mirror was a window into another world. A sense of dread filled me, a primal fear that something was deeply wrong. My heart pounded in my chest and I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The woman's gaze seemed to meet mine through the glass, and though her face was blurred, I could feel her eyes on me, cold and piercing. I could hear the wind outside, but inside the house was deathly silent. The figure moved slowly, stepping closer to the mirror's surface, and I felt an icy chill in the air, as if she was reaching out, trying to cross the threshold between her world and mine. I forced myself to move, wrenching my eyes away from the mirror and fumbling for the bedside lamp. The light flickered on, and the figure vanished, leaving only my pale reflection staring back at me. The room felt oppressive, the air thick with unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the woman in the mirror was still there, watching from just beyond the glass. Sleep was impossible after that. I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the mirror, waiting for the dawn. When the first light of morning finally crept into the room, I packed my bags and left the house without looking back. I didn't care about the remaining night I had paid for. Something about that mirror had unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. As I drove away, the image of the woman lingered in my mind. There had been something deeply wrong about her, something beyond the bounds of the natural world. It felt as though I had glimpsed another reality, a place where the boundaries between life and death, between this world and the next, were thin and fragile. Weeks later, I found myself researching the history of the house, trying to understand what I had experienced. What I discovered sent a shiver down my spine. The house had once belonged to a woman named Evelyn Hart, a recluse who was said to have lost her mind after the death of her husband. She had spent her final years in isolation, obsessively staring into a large mirror, convinced that she could see her husband on the other side. Evelyn had died in that house, and her body was found in front of the very mirror that now haunted my thoughts. The locals believed that her spirit had become trapped in the glass, forever searching for her lost love. The mirror, they said, was cursed. Whoever gazed into it for too long would see her, and risk being drawn into her world, never to return. I deleted the Airbnb app from my phone, and vowed never to speak of that weekend again. But every now and then, in the quiet moments before sleep, I think of Evelyn Hart and the mirror that held her soul. I wonder if she's still there, waiting for someone else to see her, to feel the pull of the glass, and to cross over into the place where she remains, forever trapped on the other side.